So we're starting in Romans chapter 7. Remember, recall in chapter 6, he's talking about since we are born again through baptism, we've died to sin, we've died to ourselves, and since we're having died, we're set free from sin. Why should we continue in sin since we're set free from it? And he in verse 21 of chapter 6, what fruit had ye when then those things whereof ye are now ashamed? When your life before you were a Christian, what fruit was there that you were gaining from your life as a non-Christian that, as you look back, you're ashamed of? It's interesting that should be the case as we look at our own sin and realize how we have hurt God and that we have caused Christ to pay the price on the cross because of our sin. We should look back upon that sin with shame, not pride. It's interesting to think that there are those who, having obeyed the gospel, having been baptized, still talk about their days as a non-Christian, about those awful things that they did, but yet you listen to them, and it's with almost an air of pride that they speak about those awful days of living in sin. And as, I think, have they got the point? Do they understand? Whereas here, it's clear that those things that they are now ashamed. And he makes the point, for the end of those things is death. And so that the logical conclusion is the only fruit that I had was nothing. It was death. There was no good in the sins that I was living in, and of which I ought now to be ashamed of it. And so, reasonably, we should just toss all that away. Have no interest in that whatsoever, because it didn't edify us, didn't build us up, didn't draw us any closer to God, it rather removed us from God. In verse 22, but now being made free from sin, become servants to God, ye have your fruit unto holiness, and the end, everlasting life. Diametrically opposed. A life of sin is eternal death. A life of righteous living is eternal life, everlasting life. And of course, he concludes that chapter, for the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Okay, so contrasting that, and we entered into chapter 7. Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over man as long as he liveth. And now he's going to make the point that, let me get to the right page in my notes. He's going to discuss the longevity of the law. And he's, as we look at it here, for I speak to them that know the law, the definite article, the, in that case, is really not in the text. For I speak to them that know law, the principles of law, the fundamentals, the foundation of law, and its binding upon us. And so as they understand the reasoning and philosophy of law and the necessity of law, so that's what he's talking about. I speak to them that know law, how that the law, speaking about the law of Moses, hath dominion over man as long as he liveth. Okay, and so that was the observation, that those who understand the philosophy of law, that the law of Moses, has dominion over man as long as he lives. For as long as he's alive, he is under that law. Okay, and then he goes on to illustrate it with that of a marriage. Okay, in the case particularly of the woman involved in the marriage. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband. Now, of course, we see the law of Moses had identifying sin. It also, because it identifies sin, it also identifies and distinguishes the righteous life. And faithfulness to one's spouse in marriage is taught in the law of Moses as well as the law of Christ. But even before then, the patriarchal days, they understood that when the two come together in marriage, they are joined together by God. Okay, and as it was said that let not man put asunder that which God has joined together. So as it is here, so she's bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. Okay. So then, the observation here is, if while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. The idea being that, of course, when she marries a man, she's bound to him for the rest of his life. And once he dies, she's free to remarry someone else. But if he hasn't died and she remarries somebody else, she's an adulteress. Okay? And that's the idea, that as long as her husband lives, and that she is bound to his law for his life. And take that to illustrate, as an illustration regarding the law of Moses, how one born under the law of Moses, basically in that covenant relationship upon birth, because being a son of Abraham, and of course the token of the covenant relationship in circumcision, that one is bound to God and the law of Moses for his life, for as long as that law was in effect. As long as the law is alive, that one under the covenant of Moses' covenant was bound to that law. Okay. Verse 4, wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ. So now they are becoming dead to the law, that she should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God. So now we see the illustration with a woman married to her husband. She is bound to him for as long as he lives. Once he dies, she's free to remarry. So it is with one who is under the law of Moses. As long as that law of Moses was alive and well, they were bound to that law. But when that law came to an end, when it died, they were free to remarry another, that is, Christ. Now, if you look at this wording, he says, ye are become dead to the law by the body of Christ. So it infers that they are become dead, they have died themselves. In fact, that's what I had discussed this same concept as one who has been baptized into Christ, has died to himself, so he's dead to the law as well, free to remarry. That's not quite right, as this passage makes it clear. When Christ, look at Colossians 2, verse 14. And you're probably very familiar with this passage. And it's discussing the end of the law, the fulfillment, basically. And in its fulfillment, the end of it. Okay. Let's begin in verse 9 to build the point, the idea in Colossians chapter 2, verse 9. For in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. Jesus Christ exhibits God entirely in his physical presence. Okay? That's why Jesus was surprised when Philip said to him, show us the Father and it'll be enough. It'll be sufficient. And Jesus said, have I been with you so long and you not see me, seen the Father? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So God he's the fullness of God bodily. Okay. And ye are complete in him, which is the head of all principality and power, in whom also ye are circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, the putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. So that circumcision was not a physical circumcision like that of the Old Testament, but rather it is a cutting off of the flesh, putting off of the body of sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. So that we are severed or separated from that body of sin. Okay, verse 12, buried with him in baptism. There is our own death. Since we're being buried, we are dead. Wherein also ye are risen with him through the faith of the operation of God, who hath raised him from the dead. Interesting to note, baptism is an operation of God, not an operation of man. Although we submit ourselves to baptism, and there is another who is administering this baptism, but we see it is the operation of God who hath raised him from the dead. And we see that operation of God is actually the circumcision of Christ, separating that dead man of sin from us. Okay. In verse 13, and you, being dead in your sins, and the uncircumcision of your flesh, hath he quickened or made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses. Okay. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances which was against us. That's what was happening in baptism. And in his crucifixion, he was blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. What was that handwriting of ordinances? The old law. That's right, Jenna. The old law. It was that handwriting where, first of all, the tablets upon which the Ten Commandments were inscribed, and then also the parchments that Moses had written, plus all the other inspired writers, the prophets who had written, all this law that was given them from God, these handwriting of ordinances that was against us, was the law of Moses against them? Well, it was for their benefit. It was to teach them it was to point them to the Christ. It was to tutor to bring them unto Christ, but also is to point out sin and the awfulness of sin. But in doing that, and I've said this 100 times before, I think, that in pointing out sin, it pointed out that they had sin and thereby condemned them, and that's why it was against them, because it made them aware that they were condemned. Okay? And so it was, because it condemned sin, it condemned those who had sin, which of course is everyone. So in blotting out this handwriting ordinances, this law of Moses that was against them, which was contrary to them or us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. Okay, so Jesus nailed the old law of Moses to the cross. He had fulfilled it. When he had said that not one jot or tittle of the law will be erased until all be fulfilled, he was to fulfill the law. His crucifixion upon the cross was the fruition of the old law of Moses. It brought everything to bear upon that one moment in time when Jesus died for the sins of the world. That's what the Passover was all about. That's what Abraham sacrificing Isaac upon the altar was all about. His only son, shedding his blood upon that altar. That's what that was all about. And so Christ fulfilling the law, bringing everything to a head, to a completion of fruition, nailed that law of Moses to the cross, bringing it to an end, bringing it to its death in the sense of it is no longer in force. Okay, so Christ, I guess you could say Christ killed the law of Moses, not violently, but fulfilled it. So in the death of the law of Moses, we go back to Romans chapter 7, that since the law of Moses was now dead, they were free to marry another. I must emphasize that Jesus did not destroy the law. He did not usurp it through violence. He fulfilled its purpose and brought it to a close. And it was no longer in force. But with its closure brought its death in a manner of speaking. And so it was that ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ. So the body of Christ, being crucified upon the cross, brought the death of the law, so they were free to marry another. As we continue in verse 4, that ye should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God. A lot of people don't talk about being married to Christ. The church is the bride of Christ. The church is his bride. And as we think about we being married to Jesus, puts us under his law forever. Okay. And so that's a legal issue particularly with the Jews of that day, that they were freed from the law of Moses. They didn't just deny God's word, deny the law that they had lived under for all those years growing up. They didn't just, abandon it. Rather, they were set free from it to become Christians and find salvation in Christ. In verse 5, for when we were in the flesh, speaking of while they were under the law of Moses, the motions of sins which were by the law did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. And so, as he already made the point in chapter 3, verse 23, for all has sinned to come short of the glory of God. And the law of Moses just pointed that out for them. And as they were living under the law of Moses in the flesh, the motions of sins, everything they did, the desires of the body, which were by the law, did work in our members, or their body, to bring forth fruit unto death. So basically, they're being guilty of sin like anybody else, that the fruit of that would be death. But now, we are delivered from the law of Moses, that being dead wherein we were held, that we should serve in newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. The ordinances, the handwriting of the ordinances that they were to participate in the various rituals in the sacrifices of the animals for the atoning of their sins, representative, okay, and all the things that they were to do under that law. Well, that's the oldness of the letter, but now they're in the serve in newness of spirit. What shall we say then? So with all that background, that Christ died on the cross, bringing to an end the law of Moses, bringing its death, that the law of Moses was now dead, they were free to marry Christ and to be the bride of Christ, and that they're delivered from the law, that to live in the newness of the Spirit. What do we say about all that then? What shall we say then? Verse 7. Is the law sin? God forbid. Or no, it's not. Nay, I had not known sin but by the law. For I had not known lust except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. And so this is where Paul is as so that they would not get the wrong attitude that having the law of Moses or living under the law of Moses, that there was for some reason something wrong. And so he says, is the law sin? Since the law of Moses does point out sin, does that mean that the law itself was sin? Or that living under law, that we find ourselves all guilty of sin, that therefore the law of Moses is itself sin? He said, no, God forbid. Nay, I wouldn't have known what sin was except because of the law. Verse 8, but sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. I love that word. Is there another version that we have that has a little more modern? It's what? Evil desire. Okay. So occasioned by the command, wrought in me all manner of evil desire, for without the law sin was dead. Okay, that's interesting. Without the law, sin was dead. Well, in the sense that they were unaware of it. It doesn't mean that they had no sin. It just means that sin didn't have the power over them. But when they learned what sin was, the consequences of it, that the law had pointed out for them, that's when their, how can I say it? Their appetites were primed. When you were a little kid and your dad told you, don't do this or don't do that, what did you end up doing? Well, hopefully you didn't do it, but what was your mind on? What was your mind on all the time when you're told, don't do this? Well, I wonder what's in it. I wonder why I shouldn't. What's wrong? Let's find out what it is. Let me give you an example. You remember the Red Baron? He flew this red triplane, painted bright red. You couldn't miss it. He made himself a big target of the sky because he was an ace in fighter terms, aerial combat terms. And so it was a challenge, issuing a challenge to everybody. And so with that, the idea of having red airplanes, triplane, biplane, became popular, particularly in the days of the crop dusting and the flying circuses and stuff like that. And so they had all these little red airplanes flying around the sky. Now, whatever you do for the next 30 seconds, do not think about little red airplanes. Do not have your mind on little red airplanes for the next 30 seconds. I'll cut it short, Has anybody thought about little red airplanes in the last 10 seconds? Star Wars. Well, that's the idea is, if it's the way our mind works, is that if we are given the challenge not to think about something, what do we think about? Okay. The same way as the law of Moses was given to them to identify sin, and so it was with the commandments, thou shalt not sin. So all as he said, by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of evil desire, for without the law sin was dead. That's the same idea. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. Okay. He's talking about the life under the law of Moses. The temptations there were in that law. The law has taught us what sin was. It pointed out sin and its penalty. As we look at verses 4 through 7, we are dead to the law, and one of those is thou shalt not covet, one of the 10 commandments. So they were dead in that sense to the law, but having the law having died. But in verse 8, the desire to sin was there. It became evil when it sought to override the command. Sin said, let's override the commandment. That's when Eve ate that fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They had, as far as we know, there was one commandment that they had at that time, and that was not to eat of that fruit. In Genesis chapter 3. And of course, the serpent raising question about, did God actually say that you shouldn't eat of that tree? The woman said unto the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden. He said, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. Of course, she added a little bit there from the previous, what we're privy to about what God had said. She added that part, but neither shall you touch it. That's not what he said. He just said, you don't eat of it, okay? But nevertheless, lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day that ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. That is good as be as judges. Okay. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for fruit, so she saw it was good for fruit, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and the tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave it also to her husband with her, and he did eat. So as she saw it, we see that she was tempted in all ways, like we are tempted, lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. In all these ways, the lust of the flesh, it was pleasant to the, that is good for food. The lust of the eyes, it was pleasant to the eyes. And it was the pride of life, it was a tree to be desired to make one wise. Okay, so all these things. And so in all of this, she partook of the fruit, pretty much saying, in spite of the fact that God had said, don't do this, sin said to her, as I say it figuratively, let's decide for ourselves what's right and what's wrong. She was setting herself up as the judge, disregarding the commandment of God. She was making herself as God in that sense. As we think about, and so that desire to sin was there. It became evil when it sought to override the command. Okay, don't covet. But sin said, let's override the commandment. And so she was overriding the commandment of God, do not eat of that fruit. Okay. So sin, by taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence or evil desire, for without the law sin was dead. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. So there was only one time in his life when he was not under the law, when he was a child. We talk about the age of accountability. The age of accountability, where when one matures to the point where he can identify sin and the consequences of sin, and when a child learns about lying, and finally he understands that it hurts people, it deceives people, and it separates people, that's when he becomes accountable to the act of lying. And so it is with one who is growing up, not understanding that, he's not held accountable. But when he does understand it, when he is capable of understanding it, that's when he becomes accountable. There are many people who are capable of understanding what sin is, but they don't bother to learn what it is, or they deny what sin is. So, but that does not remove them from the responsibility of understanding it. So that time in his life when he was not under the law in the sense of not amenable or not held accountable, I should say, to the law when he was a child. When the commandment came, that is when Paul understood the law, when he was old enough to know right and wrong, that's when the law came. Okay? When the commandment came, sin revived and I died. So with that sin, of course, the wages of sin is death. And so when he died, he severed his relationship with God. Okay. In verse 10, and the commandment which was ordained to life, I found to be unto death. The commandment, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not lie, bear false witnesses, all these were meant to bring us to life, so to guide us away from sin. And yet what did it do? It brought us death because we found that we sinned in that way. Paul, thinking the law was unto life, he found to be unto death. There's no justification in that old system in the sense of the law of Moses. There's no justification. It just points things out. It condemns it. It defines it. It declares it. But it doesn't have a solution for it. All it does is show the evilness of it. Look at Leviticus 18:5. Leviticus 18, verse 5. Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. I am the Lord. So, in keeping the statutes and the judgments, he shall live in them. Look at Ezekiel 20:13. But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They walked not in my statutes, and they despised my judgments, which if a man do, he shall even live in them. And my Sabbaths they greatly polluted. Then I said, I would pour out my fury upon them in the wilderness to consume them. So that they're rejecting the commandments of God, and that they perished because of that. In fact, they walked in the wilderness because of their disbelief as the reports that they'd received from the spies. But they had rejected God, And so they would be condemned because of that. So the answer was, so the point being that as they had transgressed the law of God, there was no answer for that. They would be consumed, they would be destroyed, but there was no cure for what they had, and that is the cure for sin. 2 Corinthians 3, verse 7, still talking about the law of Moses, and it's I can't say defects, but it's shortcoming as to what man need. There was no shortcoming in what it was intended to do, pointing out sin. It was the shortcoming was in its ability to bring for an answer for man's sin. It just pointed it out. So 2 Corinthians 3, verse 7. But if the ministration of death, written and engraved in stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away. So you recall that when Moses came down from the mountain, his face was glowing. So he covered his face to hide the fact that his face was glowing. It was starting to dim. It was foreshadowing the day that the glory of the law of Moses would dim as well. And as we read the book of Hebrews, where the law of Moses was replaced by a new covenant, and as we read about, like we had in Colossians 2:14, that Christ, having nailed the law to the cross, having fulfilled it, brought it to its end. And as we're studying in Romans, that the law had come to its death. So the law of Moses never deceived him. Well, so the law of Moses, it only pointed out what sin was. And in so doing, it brought them only death. Okay, and as we look in verse 10, Romans 7:10, and the commandment which was ordained to life, I found to be unto death. That's exactly what so many others had found when God had actually destroyed them, who had rejected Him. In this case, as they had lived through the centuries. There was a reason they would go to the temple once a year, and the high priest would present that sacrifice for their sins. It was once every year. But now Christ, so they would have to do this every year under the law of Moses, reminding them that they had sinned. There was no answer for sin because they always had it. They had to always make their sacrifices year by year. When Christ died, he died once for all, no more. For it's appointed unto man to die once, then cometh the judgment. Okay, that's the natural way of things, that when we die once, and then we await the judgment. But Christ in the same fashion died only once. But he died once for the sins of the entire world, for all man, for all time. So that was the solution. Christ brought in the covenant. That was the solution to the problem that man had and has. Okay, that he brings forth forgiveness of sins, whereas under the law of Moses there was no forgiveness, and that is true forgiveness, complete forgiveness. It required the death of Christ. Okay, so the law of Moses didn't provide for the solution of forgiveness of sins, but those who lived under the law of Moses, pleasing God, living by their faith, they too are saved by their faith in the one that would come. They too are saved by the blood of Christ. So when I say that Christ's blood was shed for all man for all time, I don't mean just from his death forward. I mean from his death backward as well. Even Adam and Eve, if they walked faithfully to God, the blood of Christ would cover them as well. Okay. So if Paul found that the commandment that was meant for life actually brought him death, because he found that he was guilty of sin. For sin, taken occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and it slew me. The law of Moses never deceived him into believing he could be justified by the law. And that's, the sin, it was the sin that deceived him. And we know that Satan is the big deceiver. From Genesis 3:13, it was he who deceived Eve. And He still uses deception today to deceive us. You're familiar with what we term little white lies, We soften it for us. And we've gotten so into using language that doesn't bring judgment upon others. Like we talk about extramarital affairs instead of adultery. We talk about promise or sowing your wild seed instead of fornication. All these terms that sodomy. You don't like that word because it's judgment, right? We live more like alternate lifestyle, alternative lifestyle. That's much softer and gentler. It's not so condemning. And so that's how Satan deceives us. And you rename things and you evade the real meaning of what's going on. And so Satan is very successful in deceiving people today and has been for all time, actually. So the sin taking occasion by the commandment deceived him and by it slew him. So it was the sin that deceived him, not the law of Moses. Verse 12, wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. So yes, the law, it was very beneficial. It pointed out what sin was, but what was the result when we learned about it? Well, we were deceived by sin, nevertheless. As much as we understand what sin was from the law of Moses, we were deceived by it, nevertheless. And as he had made the point before in Romans 3:23, for all have sinned to come short of the glory of God. And this is just an extension of what he had been discussing in the first 3 chapters about the nature of sin, where sin originates. And it wasn't the law of Moses that caused sin. It was man's desire to satisfy his lusts, lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but a lot of people have accused what they perceive as very strict adherence to the Bible, particularly in the Church of Christ, and how it's taught in the Church of Christ, that it causes dysfunctional families. It causes problems within the family. It causes marital problems, things like that. And so they're saying the teaching that's in the Church of Christ, which is, it's the Bible, that's the cause of dysfunctional family relationships, But they're wrong. They're missing the point that it's not the teaching of the Word of God that causes dysfunctionality at all. Rather, it's the individuals. And you go back to what Paul is addressing here is the very exact same accusation. Since the law of Moses condemned sin, and since everyone is guilty of sin, certainly the law of Moses caused them to sin. Well, that's what he's saying. No, not at all. The law of Moses was good and intended for our benefit to help us avoid sin. Okay? But what happened, of course, is sin itself deceived me. And so, as he relates it to himself, I sinned under that. And so everyone else also sinned. And of course, the result is condemnation unto death. And verse 12, for the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. Look at Hebrews 10, verse 4. It's pretty much what I was talking about earlier. Let's begin in verse 1. For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, it was pointing to the Christian age when the real spiritual would be here, and not the very image of the things, can never with those sacrifices which they offered year by year continually make the comers thereunto perfect. So as they would go year by year to make their sacrifices, they would always have their sin. It couldn't make them perfect. Okay, for then would they not have ceased to be offered? If the sacrifices did make them perfect, that is, that they did have forgiveness of sins through that, why would why did they continue to make the offerings? If they did, they would stop making the offerings, because that the worshipers, once purged, should have had no more conscience of sins. They would have no more awareness of sins, because they'd been forgiven. But in those sacrifices, there is a remembrance again made of sins every year. For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins. And that's the shortcoming of the law of Moses. Even though they were commanded to make these sacrifices for atoning of sins, it never provided the blood that they shed on the altar, and they presented to God in the Holy of Holies by the high priest, never did provide for forgiveness of sins. It could never take away sins. And that was the shortcoming of the law of Moses. Okay. Wherefore, when he cometh into the world, he saith, sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not, but a body hast thou prepared for me. It's identifying that the sacrifices didn't provide for, it did not satisfy God in justifying mankind. There had to be something greater. And that's why Christ came. That's why his body was prepared for him, that he would be the sacrifice to atone for our sins. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, thou hast no pleasure. It doesn't mean he didn't want them to make those sacrifices. It means that they didn't do the job of justification. It didn't satisfy God's sense of justice. Okay, and as we've seen, verse 7, then said I, lo, I come, in the volume of the book it is written of me, to do thy will, O God. So Christ willingly came to die in our stead. The body was prepared for him. That was the suitable sacrifice. Now then, so the problem was sin was still in the world during the entire time that the law of Moses was in force. Well, I don't mean to say that there's no sin today. I don't mean that. What I mean is today we have full forgiveness. We can be completely forgiven today. And if that's not a motivating factor to try to help us not to sin, I don't know what could be. The fact that we are pure from sin, clean, washed clean from sin. We are as pure as the day we were born. What a motivation to not sin, to try to retain that purity. Okay. So, we'll stop here with the law being holy. If there are any questions, perhaps we can address them next week. Or if you have any questions now, maybe I can write them down so we can address them regarding this passage. I'll tell you what, this passage is so misrepresented regarding its purpose and use. I'll discuss that more next week and how it's used incorrectly. But, of course, I've got all the right answers. But, I appreciate your attention, and we'll continue our study next week. Thanks.